Good day all protocols of course being observed. I want to say how delighted I am that you've asked me to share a few words with you today, and I wish I could be there in person. But as you know, I'm strongly of the view that our regions, Africa and the Caribbean, have a moral responsibility to become closer as we seize our Atlantic destinies on both sides. I could speak at length on these matters, but today is not that time. For today, we're going to speak about the climate crisis and how both of us in the Caribbean and in Africa are on the receiving end of this crisis that we didn't cause. In essence, we are unjustly and disproportionately impacted by issues that we did not create. There's no doubting it. The world's climate has been changing. You see it in Africa, we see it in the Caribbean, and with devastating consequences. At the same time, scientific research has also shown us that temperatures on the African continent are warming faster than the global average over land and oceans. In fact, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has predicted that critical global warming levels will likely be reached in Africa earlier than the middle of this century. In our own case in the Caribbean, we expect it, if things don't change, to be as early as within 15 years. These are dangerously worrying situations for both of us. And in your case in the continent, it comes with an already difficult situation that you face in terms of the development trajectory. The level of poverty in Africa remains too high, with more than 470 million Africans expected to live in extreme poverty this year. And according to the World Food Programme, 2 years ago in 2020, almost 100 million people in Africa suffered from acute food insecurity and needed humanitarian assistance. This is the base from which you start. And with the advent of more frequent and more severe climate-related disasters such as floods and windstorms and droughts, hurricanes, landslides, and pest outbreaks, more lives will be upended and more livelihoods totally destroyed. It is with this utmost urgency and understanding, therefore, that we must fully come to grips with current and future implications that this climate crisis will have to us as human beings, as those who are most vulnerable. Already the socioeconomic impact that it is having in Africa is substantial and widespread, as you know, and reports have shown that it is threatening to derail your region's development gains in the same way that our region's development gains have been displaced. The truth is that we are told that the cost to the continent will be at least $50 billion annually by the year 2030. Concurrently, the reduction in GDP per capita growth in high warming scenario that is being modeled is projected between 16 to 64% by 2030, depending on where you look. My friends, despite these precarious economic, social, and climatic positions, African countries remain committed to addressing the global climate challenges through their nationally determined contributions to the reducing of global carbon emissions. It cannot be ignored, however, that the most developed and emerging economies have overwhelmingly contributed to this current predicament. Scientists concluded that about 85% of the global carbon budget is already used up, with only 400 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent left if the net zero goal is to be achieved by 2050. The reality is that a large proportion of those global carbon credits have come from developed and emerging economies. In fact, Africa's historical and current share of the global carbon emissions has measured less than 3%. Less than 3%. It is therefore unjust that despite African countries contributing so little to this climate crisis, its impacts and its effects are also so disproportionately distributed as it is in the region. That is why we call for a simple definition for climate vulnerability, and that definition can simply be stated, and transparently so, that if your country is likely to suffer from climatic consequences that will have an impact on more than 5% of your GDP, then you ought to be considered as a climate vulnerable country. We need this kind of transparent definition if we are to see greater progress with international financial markets and international financial institutions being able to transparently support our efforts to do the adaptation and the mitigation that is so necessary now. The mitigation will, of course, unlock private sector funds, but the adaptation doesn't have a revenue stream that will make it easy for the private sector to involve themselves in, and hence adaptation funds will have to be borne at the cost of either the balance sheet of our countries or indeed through the receipt of grant fundings. This has, of course, nothing to do with the fiscal space that is immediately available to us. So if we are to truly discuss climate justice and to see that it prevails, the current global climate finance architecture has to be reformed. And this will therefore allow you to lift millions of your people out of poverty, while at the same time building your climate resilience by ensuring that you develop all of your available energy resources. And I mean all, and I'll come to that later in my speech, that are clean. During COP26, I asked, what must we say to our people living on the front line in the Caribbean, or in Africa, or in the Pacific, when both ambition and some of the needed faces to be at meetings are absent? And what excuse should we give for their failure? In the words of Eddie Grant, I said then, will they mourn us on the front line? I repeat them today. Of the $100 billion US that was committed by developed countries to developing countries for climate adaptation, in 2019, only $79.6 billion was mobilized. And of course, that $100 billion had a different level of impact when it was stated 5-6 years ago. Africa, in 2019, of that $79.6 billion, received only $18.5 billion when the funds were mobilized. I say to you again that without the sufficient financial resources and support, developing countries will not be able to build their climate resilience or address the extreme energy poverty or to successfully transition themselves to a net zero path by 2050. I've made the case for the Caribbean and developing nations, and I'll make it here again. The extent of resources needed for the climate crisis actions and for just energy transition has fallen far, far short of the expectations, or in fact, what is needed to be able to protect us sufficiently. What currently exists is highly fragmented, with multiple stakeholders often having overlapping mandates, complex rules and regulations, and stringent requirements. There is need for better harmonization of the requirements and better coordination of all existing climate funds so that it can redound to successfully building more resilient countries and, most importantly, as we all know, to improve our ability to save lives, not in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, but in millions. There is need as well for a greater access and ownership of this architecture. Currently, all global climate funds are based outside of Africa, and so at best they can only attempt to understand and address the continent's special needs and circumstances on this crisis. Improving Africa's ownership of these funds and access to these funds in terms of your objectives, implementation actions, and expected results is critical if we are going to ensure that there's a buy-in also by your local communities and leaders. There also needs to be greater consideration to augmenting pre-existing commitments to adequately reflect the true opportunity costs of this crisis in Africa and other developing regions, as well as to leverage existing innovative climate finance instruments. Green finance instruments such as green bonds or green loans can help in that regard. The use of government guarantees to unlock significant amounts of funds is also one that we should be pursuing. Carbon markets, debt for climate swaps, and climate-linked debt instruments are also other financial instruments that ought to be explored. We in Barbados here are seeking to do a variation of a debt for nature swap. And with the help of the Inter-American Development Bank and Nature's Conservancy, we are now about to repurchase a significant portion of our debt, $150 million US, and the interest savings that will be garnered from that exercise will be used to be able to establish and finance a marine conservation trust. But we are only scratching the surface. We need to see the pledging of existing SDRs made available to regional development banks to give them the opportunity to be able to pursue all of these types of innovative steps. Attracting the private sector is equally important to scaling up climate finance on the continent, particularly in the areas of mitigation. For example, we can also look at blended finance to de-risk private green finance instrument investments in Africa. And while green banks and national climate funds could further be promoted to help mobilize more climate finance domestically, we are not seeing sufficient movement with respect to these. My friends, we must also address the elephant in the room. And what is that? The International Energy Agency expects that net zero in 2050 does not mean no fossil fuels. It means limited fossil fuel usage. And what is that limited usage? That 20% of the mix is still expected to come from fossil fuels. But what cannot happen is that we determine that only those who are currently in the business of fossil fuels have that opportunity to utilize their resources to be able to finance the transition that they need to net zero. Indeed, everyone acknowledges that natural gas will be and must be that bridge of clean energy in the transition to renewables. And to that extent, therefore, we must have serious discussions as to who can appropriately be able to unlock their fossil fuel potential while not going overboard, while not impacting on the clear ambitions that we must maintain to ensure climate justice in this world. But to simply assume that only those with existing resources should have that opportunity and that no new exploitation should take place is to literally disproportionately impact and affect developing countries yet again. Finally, African nations must also address the issues of the institutional, regulatory and supportive policy reforms if we are to unlock this climate finance and to ensure that our citizens benefit justly. In my own country, we have just announced that every citizen who is a homeowner should have as of right access to renewable energy resources, primarily photovoltaic panels, but in some instances micro wind turbines. Why? Because the wind and the sun and the water do not belong to any of us singularly. They are the patrimony of our countries, and they must be used to enfranchise and to protect our citizens as far as possible. I commend my friends, as I close, African countries and leaders for their efforts in the front line of this crisis. Much like the challenges we face here in the Caribbean, the climate finance flows we all know have not been commensurate with our needs and climate justice. And we are running out of time. It will take concerted efforts of all stakeholders to support this climate resilience we must develop and the just energy transition that must be taking place in Africa and in the Caribbean. In the face of the climate crisis, your cause is our cause. Climate justice and better financing of climate resilience is critical if we are truly to address the crisis which confronts us all. And let me end by sharing one last example of what we have been able to do. Barbados is now currently the largest issuer of bonds with natural disaster clauses. Had the world given the developing countries the opportunity to have natural disaster and pandemic clauses during the course of these last 2 years, it would have unlocked trillions of dollars rather than the modest debt service suspension initiative of 12 billion that was established by the international financial institutions as a mechanism for helping only poor countries. It would have been able to assist middle-income countries. It would have been able to avert the loss of lives in serious ways by ensuring that governments had access to greater liquidity and to be able to ensure that they could support and shield the most vulnerable in our populations. My friends, these things are not rocket science, but what they require is political will and sensitivity. Sensitivity to hear people, see people, and feel people, and to know that our obligations within the responses of governments and the private sector, development finance institutions, is to be able to create that framework that makes their lives easier and better, and not putting them, regrettably, on the front line in our own countries on this climate crisis that we did not create. I believe we can do better. I believe we can do more, but we require partnership and we require the same message being repeated over and over. Let us, to the task, ensure that we create that pathway to protect the people of Africa and the people of the Caribbean. Thank you very much.